All right. So, as a philosopher, I bet you've spent a lot of time, like, really thinking about those big questions,
Yeah.
about knowledge and values and how those all kind of fit together in the human experience. Well, get ready, because today we're going deep into the work of Isaiah Berlin. Now, he may not be a household name like Plato or Aristotle, but his ideas, I think, are going to be surprisingly relevant, I'd say, for a philosopher like you.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that makes Berlin so fascinating is that he doesn't fit into any one philosophical box neatly. He started out very much immersed in the world of logic and language, but he ends up grappling with these super profound questions about history and politics and the nature of human values.
Exactly. And I think that's what makes this deep dive such a great fit for a philosopher because, I mean, we're not just getting like a summary of his ideas. It's more like we're kind of exploring the way his thinking evolved, right?
Mhm.
The twists and turns of his intellectual journey, which is kind of a philosophical argument in itself.
Yeah, definitely. And his journey really starts at Oxford in the mid 20th century, surrounded by these like giants of analytic philosophy, people like A.J. Ayer and J.L. Austin. He's right there in the middle of it all. Logical positivism, just dissecting language, trying to like pin down the boundaries of what we can really know.
Okay, so picture this. Young Isaiah Berlin, just incredibly sharp, debating the finer points of logical positivism with like some of the brightest minds of his time. I mean, that's pretty heady stuff, right? But then something kind of interesting happens.
He shifts, yeah. He starts to like feel the very analytical approach of logical positivism. It's kind of limiting. Like it's not letting him engage with the big questions that he's really fascinated by.
So he moves away from pure logic and just dives headfirst into the history of ideas.
Mm.
I mean, that's a pretty bold move, especially for someone who's so deeply embedded in analytic philosophy.
Yeah, it is. And it really shows, I think, his intellectual restlessness,
Yeah.
and his conviction that philosophy shouldn't be like limited to abstract systems, right? He saw it as a way to tackle these huge, almost unanswerable questions about like the human condition, about morality, freedom, the forces that shape history. And for him, exploring those questions meant, going beyond just logic, pure logic, and actually looking at how these things played out in the world, in the messy, complicated world of human history and politics.
It's almost like he's saying, okay, logic's great, but it's only going to get us so far. Like, if we really want to get a grip on the human experience, we have to look at how these big ideas actually play out in the lives of real people. The choices they make, the societies they create.
Exactly. And this is what leads him to, I think, one of his most profound insights, which is, that philosophy isn't just about the facts, it's actually about the categories we use to think about the world. The thought spectacles, as he called them that, kind of shape the way we see and interpret reality.
I mean, that's something I think any philosopher is going to get, right? It's like he's saying, hold on, before we even talk about knowledge and truth, let's examine the very tools we're using to think about those things in the first place.
Right. And what's even more radical, I think, is that Berlin argues that these categories, these thought spectacles, they're not fixed. Like someone like Kant might have said, they're not fixed and unchanging. He says they're fluid, they evolve, they're products of history and culture.
Whoa, okay, now we're getting into some pretty deep philosophical waters, right?
Yeah.
Because it's like he's questioning the foundation of how we understand knowledge. Like, if
Yeah.
the tools we're using to think are constantly changing, well, what does that mean for the pursuit of objective truth? Wow.
Right. That's a huge question. And Berlin grapples with that, throughout his work. And it leads him to another key insight, which he calls the problem of logical translation. He rejects the idea that you can just take any statement and kind of neatly reduce it to this single universally valid proposition. He argues that different languages, different cultures, different historical periods, they all have their own unique ways of understanding and expressing reality.
So he's saying that trying to force everything into one like standardized system of understanding, it's not only impossible, but it could actually be like distorting. Like it misses those little nuances, the richness, the complexity of human thought.
Exactly. And that has huge implications for how we look at disciplines like history and the humanities. For Berlin, trying to impose a scientific model of explanation onto those fields, trying to find universal laws of human events is like totally wrong. It's a flawed approach. History, literature, art, it's all about understanding those unique expressions of human experience that just defy easy categorization.
It's like he's saying, look, the scientific method is awesome for understanding the natural world, but when it comes to humans, we need a different set of tools. We need to be able to like appreciate the messiness, the contradictions, the sheer variety of human experience.
Exactly. And, that leads us to, I think, one of Berlin's most famous and influential ideas. One that's like sparked tons of debate among philosophers, the concept of value pluralism.
Okay, now we're getting to the good stuff, right? Value pluralism. I have a feeling this one's going to be especially interesting for our philosopher listener. Because, I mean, this challenges some very basic assumptions we have about the nature of values and morality.
Right. Oh, absolutely. Berlin's argument is basically this. The human world is not a neat and tidy system where all values fit together perfectly under some, grand unifying truth.
So, instead of always looking for that one perfect answer, the one right way to live, Berlin's saying we have to accept that there are multiple and, often competing values or truths. I mean, that's going to cause some controversy among philosophers, right?
Yeah, for sure. It really does. I mean, he's challenging this, deep urge in philosophy, going all the way back to Plato to try and find a unified, all-encompassing system to explain everything. He's basically saying, embrace the mess. Accept the fact that human values, they're diverse, they're complicated, and sometimes they just clash.
Yeah, and I mean, for a philosopher, that's a pretty big deal, right?
Yeah.
Because it goes against this whole idea that, we can build this perfectly rational and harmonious ethical system. It almost suggests that, there might be these fundamental conflicts between values that we really care about, and we can't just resolve them.
Exactly. And he contrasts this with what he calls monism, which is the idea that there's, the single underlying truth or principle that explains everything, that gives us a clear hierarchy of values. But for Berlin, that kind of thinking just doesn't work when you actually look at the real world.
Okay, so give us some examples. What are some of these, clashing values that Berlin's talking about? Because I think concrete examples always help make these abstract philosophical ideas a little bit easier to grasp.
Well, think about the classic tension between liberty and equality, or, the conflict between justice and mercy. These are fundamental values that, we're always struggling with, right? Both personally and in terms of political philosophy. And Berlin's point is that you can't just magically make these conflicts go away. They're built into the human experience.
Okay, I see where he's going with this. But how does this idea of value pluralism, with all these different values and no clear ranking system, how does that connect to his concept of liberty? Because, I mean, that seems to be a really central part of his political philosophy, right?
Yeah, and it's really the key to understanding how Berlin defends liberalism. For him, recognizing this inherent plurality of values, that's what makes protecting individual freedom so important. If there are multiple valid ways to live a good life, if there isn't just one right answer to these big questions about values, then people need the freedom to choose their own path. They need the freedom to pursue those values that, really speak to them, even if those values clash with what other people believe.
So value pluralism becomes the foundation for his argument for individual freedom. It's almost like he's saying, look, we can't force people into one single mold because there is no single mold. We have to create a society that allows for different values, different ways of life.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And that brings us to, I think, another crucial part of Berlin's thinking, something I know will be really interesting to a philosopher, his distinction between what he calls negative liberty and positive liberty.
Ah, yes, the famous two concepts of liberty. It's a distinction that's been, debated and discussed probably endlessly in political philosophy. I'm sure our listener is very familiar with it. But, Berlin brings his own unique perspective to this, right?
He does. And I think, especially for a philosopher, his critique of Rousseau's idea of the general will is particularly interesting. You're probably familiar with Rousseau's argument that true freedom is actually found in obeying the general will, this kind of collective will of the community that supposedly represents what's best for everyone.
Right. And the idea there is that individuals might actually need to be, forced to follow this general will because, they could be mistaken about what they really want. That's a pretty tough concept to wrap your head around, both philosophically and politically.
Oh, absolutely. And Berlin is very suspicious of this line of thinking. He sees it as, potentially dangerous because it could be used to justify all sorts of coercion and authoritarianism, in the name of this supposedly higher good.
So he sees, a potential for manipulation and even tyranny hidden within this idea of the general will. Even if the intentions are good, the idea itself could be used to suppress individual freedom, in the name of some abstract collective goal.
Exactly. And Berlin argues that ultimately this whole concept of a general will is kind of an illusion. It's based on this idea that there's this single unified true self that everyone shares, a self that can be perfectly aligned with the will of the community. But Berlin, as a good pluralist, rejects that idea. He sees the self as, inherently diverse, multifaceted, constantly changing. There's no one true self that we can just discover and then use to justify some, massive political project.
So he's pushing back against this potentially dangerous idea that we can force people to conform to some abstract notion of the collective good. But I mean, he's not saying that positive liberty, this freedom to act according to your will, is a bad thing, is he?
No, not at all. I think that's important to clarify. Berlin's not against positive liberty in itself. What he's warning against is the potential for it to be manipulated, to be used to justify suppressing individual freedom and imposing this one supposedly correct way of life.
So how does this all connect back to his idea of value pluralism?
Yeah.
What's the link between these two concepts?
Well, I think the connection is this. For Berlin, recognizing that there are multiple, often conflicting values is what makes protecting both negative and positive liberty so important. Negative liberty, freedom from interference, allows individuals to choose their own path, to pursue those values that they find most meaningful without being overly restricted. Positive liberty, or the freedom to actually act on your will, gives people the space to shape their own lives, to develop their own ideas about what's good. And both forms of liberty are essential for a society that truly respects the richness and complexity of human experience.
Okay, so it's about finding that balance, right? Recognizing the value of both negative and positive liberty while also being aware of the potential dangers that come with each. It's about creating a society where individuals can flourish, while also making sure we protect against the possibility of coercion and tyranny.
That's a great way to put it. And this leads us to another really fascinating aspect of Berlin's thinking, something that I think you as a philosopher will find really resonates. His ideas about political judgment and how we should act politically. He argues that effective political leadership, it's not just about applying some abstract theoretical framework, it requires something more.
So it's not enough to just read all the classic political philosophers. You can't just, memorize Locke and Rousseau and Mill and think you're going to be some brilliant leader.
Exactly, Berlin would say, that's only half the picture, maybe even less. You need this thing he calls a sense of reality. This ability to grasp the nuances of a situation, to understand how people actually behave, to kind of see the unintended consequences of actions before they happen. It's like a kind of wisdom that goes beyond just abstract theories, right? And it requires a deep understanding of, human nature and history and just how complex the social world really is.
Okay, I like that sense of reality. So break that down for us. How do you develop that? That's something you can learn from a book.
Not really. I mean, it's more like an art than a science, I think. It's about understanding, the details of a situation, the subtle ways people interact with each other, those often unpredictable results of political decisions. It's a kind of wisdom that's owned, through experience, careful observation, and a willingness to learn from your mistakes.
So it's like the difference between studying a map and actually, navigating a terrain, right? The map gives you the big picture, but you need a feel for the land, right? Like an intuition for how to adapt, to make the right choices as you go.
Yeah, that's a perfect analogy. And Berlin's own life is a great example of that kind of flexible thinking, Remember how he moved from that super rigorous world of logical positivism to a more nuanced and historically grounded way of studying ideas? He wasn't afraid to, change his approach, to follow where his intellectual curiosity led him.
That's a good point. It's like he really lived this approach that he talks about in his political philosophy, right? He wasn't scared to challenge his own assumptions, to kind of embrace the complexity of the world and to say, hey, there's no one right way to understand things.
Exactly. And that sense of reality connects so well to his ideas about value pluralism, If you recognize that there are multiple values at play, often conflicting values, then you know that there's no cookie cutter solution to every problem. You need to be able to adapt, to compromise, to find solutions that actually work in a specific context, And that takes into account everyone's different perspectives and values.
This is making me think about the state of our political discourse today. It seems like so much of it is just dominated by these rigid ideologies, these super simplistic answers to these incredibly complex problems. It's almost as if people are so attacked to their maps that they've completely lost sight of the actual terrain.
Yeah, that's a really insightful observation. And Berlin was very aware of the dangers of that kind of rigid thinking. He understood that human actions, they always have unintended consequences. We can't predict the future perfectly. And he warns against sacrificing the present for some abstract future goal, especially when that sacrifice means violating basic moral principles.
Right. Which brings us to another important part of Berlin's thought, and one that I know a lot of philosophers think about a lot, that relationship between, the ends and the means in politics. How do we balance our desire for a better world with the, moral imperative to act justly right now?
Yeah, that's something Berlin grapples with throughout his work. He was so aware of the dangers of utopianism, like the idea that you can achieve this perfect future state if you're just willing to use any means necessary to get there. And he saw how that kind of thinking often leads to tyranny and oppression, to justifying horrible acts in the name of some abstract ideal.
So it's like he's saying, hey, be careful. Like, even with the best intentions, we can actually cause more harm than good if we don't pay attention to how we're trying to reach our goals.
Right. And I think that's why he puts so much emphasis on individual liberty, on protecting those basic rights and freedoms that allow people to pursue their own ideas of what a good life looks like. For Berlin, respecting individual liberty isn't just some abstract principle. It's about preventing like utopian thinking and resisting that temptation to impose our own vision of the good on others, no matter how well-meaning we might be.
So for Berlin, protecting individual liberty isn't just about like maximizing choices. It's also about creating a space where we can think about those big moral questions.
Yeah.
How should we live together when we have all these different values? It's about having a society that values tolerance and respect and the freedom to disagree.
Absolutely. And in a world where political discussions often seem so full of like extremism and rigid ideology, Berlin's call for moderation and compromise and recognizing that we have a plurality of values, it's incredibly powerful. I mean, it's a reminder that a truly free and just society is one that welcomes a diversity of perspectives, right?
Yeah.
A variety of ways of life, and a willingness to engage in respectful dialogue, even when we have those differences.
Wait, so to sum it all up, what are some of the key takeaways for our philosopher listener from this deep dive into Isaiah Berlin, right? What are those big ideas that'll stick with them?
For me, I think it's this idea that philosophy is not just about getting the right answers. It's about asking the right questions,
Yeah.
challenging our assumptions, being open to ambiguity and complexity. And Berlin, with his unusual path and his really nuanced way of approaching these fundamental questions, he embodies that spirit of intellectual curiosity and open-mindedness.
It's a reminder that the search for knowledge, it's a journey. It's something we do our whole lives. And it means constantly questioning, exploring, and refining our understanding of the world.
Exactly. And I think Berlin put it beautifully when he said, to understand is to perceive patterns. So let's keep looking for those patterns. Let's keep making those connections. And most importantly, let's keep the conversation going.
Beautifully said. And to our listener, as you continue on your own philosophical journey, remember Berlin's insights, right? About the limits of our knowledge, the importance of individual freedom, and the constant challenge of trying to balance these different values in a world that's so pluralistic.
Keep those thought spectacles clean, and we'll catch you on the next deep dive.